Railroad engineers, have you ever come across anything creepy or weird on the tracks while driving your train? Up in the coal mines of Wyoming they have what rail crews call the Golden Arches. It's just a yellow painted framework that has speakers on it that the empty coal trains pass through. A warning is played on repeat saying in Spanish and English, danger. Get out. This car is about to be loaded. Loaded coal cars get dumped at power plant pits where huge augers break it up. I guess more than a few poor souls have been augered up accidentally after being covered up with coal. Went by a few movie shoots. Biggest one was the first Transformers movie, the scene where Bumblebee gets caught. A lot of movies are shot in that area by the First Street Bridge in LA. Pretty sure there is a P studio not far from there too. There is a nudist colony on one run where an old guy would always come out and wave at the trains. Knew we were coming since there were road crossings that we had to whistle for. Got mooned by some guys on a golf course. Not pretty. Corncobs keep turning up on the line. There were 2 just last year. They just stare at you until the track maintenance guys move them. In the event of a corncob. I'm a conductor, so I'm the guy that sits directly to the left of the engineer. I haven't been doing it for too long yet, so I probably haven't seen the amount of stuff a qualified engineer has. My first week as a trainee on the job, we came across a dead pony next to the tracks that must have been hit only a few hours earlier. The next morning going back the other way we passed by it again and it looked like what you would expect to see on a Discovery Channel show. Scavengers had gotten to it that night and it was maybe half a pony at this point. Nature is pretty rad. The death of the Pony Express was a sad but necessary development in the history of both travel and technology. Conductor, I sit like right beside the engineer, give me a break. Here, hoping to ruin your hopes and dreams of hearing about weird stuff. I have hit fridges, hay bales, a few cows, and I've seen a lot of people getting it on beside the tracks. I guess trains are an aphrodisiac of some kind for people. I thought I found a dead baby under a bridge. I was stopped waiting for my signal and I noticed a bundle of clothes and what looked like the body of a small child underneath the bridge. My heart was pounding like crazy as I approached it. Turned out it was a doll, some used needles, and some discarded clothes. I was relieved. One time I went skinny dipping with some friends, then we all stood next to the track naked as a train went by. Hopefully it brightened the engineer's day. Depends on what gender you are, I'm sure. As a previous train driver in Sydney, Australia, there were 2 spots to look for naked women who would regularly sunbake naked in fire backyards in summer. I've also ran over a lot of stuff like bikes, shopping trolleys, carts and a lounge. Weirdest thing I've seen was when preparing my train in the yard I found a brown paper bag with a huge black corn cob in it, and yes, I left it there. For the love of science and titties. The East Hills and Bondi Junction lines. NZ here. We've hit sculptures, trolleys etc. Our nearest major incident was when Mila saw a kid dragging a manhole cover onto the tracks. Call TC for an all train stop. It's not funny. A manhole cover could easily take a train off the tracks, and this was on a bridge over water. There is a routine here in Tokyo to deal with people on the rails. The government even charges a fee to the family of suicidal guys, given they interrupted the traffic. My favorite about that is the signs in the stations. If someone commits suicide, the signs say as much in Japanese, but the English is passenger injury. Yes, a very serious injury. My brother was a lifeguard and used to walk to work across several train tracks. One day, a train was stopped on one of the tracks and my brother saw a figure lying prostrate next to the train in a pool of blood. It turns out the guy had tried to crawl underneath the train while it was stopped, only to have the train start moving while he was underneath it. The guy must have been about 60 years old. The train had crushed one of his legs. Being a lifeguard, my brother made a tourniquet, called 911, etc. The man survived, but his leg had to be amputated. The paramedics said that he would have died within the hour from blood loss if my brother hadn't been there. Probably the strangest, most messed up thing would be the time we hit a flock of sheep at line speed, 110 kph or about 70 mph. No idea how they got there. Guess the fence fell over or the gate was left open, but the first I saw of them was what appeared to be long grass covering the tracks ahead. A second later we realize they are sheep, so start leaning on the whistle. A matter of seconds after that and we're on top of them. Can't forget the awful, continuous noise it made, nor can I unsee the bits of wool and guts on flicking up onto the windscreen. The smell itself was horrendous, especially once the heat of dead sheep started cooking itself on hot traction motors underneath. We pulled up at the next crossing loop to cross another train, so we got out and viewed the damage. I used to have photos, but that phone has since died. I'm no engineer, but I saw a Domino's delivery guy make a delivery to a train that had been at a crossing for an hour or so. I'm not a train engineer per se, but I've spent lots of years working on the signals of the East Coast. I'd say one of the most interesting things I've seen are the villages of people that really pop up in the right spots. Tons of people, dogs, homeless villages with friendly people who aren't afraid or embarrassed ever at all. Also, in some mountain towns of West Virginia, there are some unique folks with tracks running through their properties. My grandma grew up with train tracks just feet from her front door. Train tracks in the front yard, the big sandy in the back, are Kentucky. My brother-in-law oversees the maintenance of all kinds of trains. I asked him this very question a while ago. He said that all sorts of weird crap ends up on the front of trains. Most notably, he once had to remove a human head embedded in the front. Where the rest of the body is, we'll probably never know. My dad works on the trains in Northern California. Quite a few years ago, the foreman of the shop told him to check out the underside of the train and clear any debris. Wild dogs frequently get hit by the trains and can sometimes cause problems. A few minutes with a flashlight and my dad sees part of a skull with long brown hair attached. Turns out the train had hit a drunk from a nearby homeless camp that had passed out on the tracks, and the wild dogs kept getting hit because they were eating the poor bastard. One time my cat walked onto my tracks and derailed the freight train I had just bow and knocked over most of the forest. If the passengers will look to their right, you will see a sad man. That is all. Well, I'm not in the railroad industry, but my buddy is a conductor, and while he was conducting, his train, a girl ran out of a chapel in her wedding dress right onto the tracks, and well, you know the ending. He was in therapy for quite a while. I was working at a BNSF railway in Stockton, CA, maintaining the cranes that pull cars off the tracks when a freight engine rolled in with the front end a little caved in, covered in red. The entire front end was covered in what appeared to be red bloody chunks, a paste left over from rolling through maybe a herd of cattle, or a horde of zombies. I didn't know what to think. I felt my stomach churn, and my co-worker turned green and heaved a bit. I asked the foreman what happened. He told me some teenager jumped out in front of it. Later, I grew a pair and walked up to it as these folks were cleaning it without any signs of being affected by the sight. Turns out the train hit a stalled fiberglass trailer filled with tomatoes that was headed to the Hunt's Cannery in Oakdale. TLDR. Saw the train covered in red bits. Told it was a popped person. Turns out it was tomatoes. Class 1 freight conductor. A few things. 16-year-old with his head and shoulders 50 feet up the track, with his body laying beside the track next to us. Friday night yard job, we saw two males freaking in the middle of a tunnel, just crap-faced, trying to wave us by like we were not a train on tracks. Just laid on the whistle until they left. I remember recrewing a train that had killed someone, and spending an hour looking in the bush for their hand. I didn't find it, then stepping in something that was red with hair. Going north, we hit a moose, not too far from the bunkhouse. Called up on the radio. Someone came down and grabbed it, cleaned it up, and we all ate it that night. I'm sure there is more, but it all blends in after a while. Takes a lot to stand out. Well, my grandfather used to work on the railroad as an engineer. He always tells me the story about how he almost hit a house. And it wasn't a dad joke. They were moving this double wide across the tracks and they were being particularly slow about it, considering a giant freight train was barreling down the tracks and them blowing its horn. About 10 yards out, they finally got all the way across the tracks. My grandfather said he almost crap himself. That's pretty much his weirdest story. I am a station attendant. I have a few stories. Found a dead kangaroo on a train, so I had to lock off the carriage to the train. Had to stop a transgender lady from being on the tracks who was attempting to commit suicide. I think it was a bad breakup. Trains were cancelled so she wouldn't be hit. Managed to calm her down and convinced her to get up and call a friend to meet her. Had to stand in the way of a deranged woman who threatened to jump in front of a train until the police arrived. Had a homeless person steal an artificial plant after I stopped him from breaking into one of the station shops. A lady's handbag managed to pull an escalator step out. She wanted her handbag damages to be paid by the rail company. We said only if she paid for the repair of the escalator. Lots of freaking and adult toys in strange places. There are others, but I think that is enough. My grandpa was a train engineer, and the weirdest story he told me was when he was driving a train somewhere through Alabama and saw a dead body on the side of the tracks. He said the man looked homeless and had severe facial damage and was laying by the tracks covered in blood. He did call the police but said he heard nothing of what happened after. In my short career of 6 years working in Australia, the only thing that amounts to anything remotely funny was when I hit an emu in the outback. It's not strange to hit a few kangaroos or goats, but this day an emu stepped in front and it exploded into feathers. I mean, they went everywhere, around the door frames and stuck in the windscreen wipers. It's hard to put into words, but thinking back, it was a had to be there moment. Not a railroad engineer, but the last time I went on a train, it was from Seattle to California. On the second night, we suddenly stopped and were waiting for a while. Apparently there had been a naked woman running along the train track and laid down and let the train go over her. I looked out the window after we stopped and heard the news. Well, sure enough, she was outside, looking right at me. I was 10 and I was scared as frick. Conductor for CSX here. Weirdest was we almost hit a cow or bull. It's night time and we're going along and a stretch of woods comes up and we turn off our lights to see the signal better, and there is a big black spot on the rails up ahead. You can see light off the rails for a long time, and it is starting to shift a bit, so engineer hits the lights and crap you not was a massive black cow bull walking across the rails. It was weird. I've seen tons of deer, coyote and other small Ohio animals. We didn't hit it but pretty close. Sorry for format spelling, I am on my phone. Train driver from Denmark here. In my experience, the tracks send out a vibe that brings all the people wearing tinfoil hats to us. That or the Danish DMV just won't issue driver's lessons to batshit crazy people. My uncle was an engineer for years. He said that severed limbs were a very commonplace find on the tracks. He also said that when hitting cows you just ducked below the windows and would wait for the unfelt pop, like a big meat-filled balloon. Second engineer on intermodal freight trains between South and West Australia for 4 years. Highly remote part of Australia with extreme temperatures all year round. Most unusual things I have witnessed. 1. Thousands of dead kangaroos. 2. Aboriginal communities living off the grid and naked. 3. Weird flashes of light. Multiple colors. 4. Cars dumped on the track, which we have no choice but to hit. 5. Large commercial plane with no decal in a very unusual spot. Desert basically. And yes, like others have said, many drunk men passed out near tracks. Large commercial plane with no decals in the middle of nowhere. Conspiracy in progress. The creepiest thing we found was probably a jawbone. Yes, it was human. Been there for a while. Likely from a suicide. Oh, and also a dead cat that had got caught in the cable run. Working on London Underground, you don't really find much creepy stuff. It's mostly just stories people spread around about ghosts and stuff. And plenty of corpses and or body parts. We often got called to incidents to make sure no bits of bone were going to block up points. Not me. Weird or creepy, but I'm telling it anyway. My dad is a retired engineer for Union Pacific. Years ago he saw a coyote feeding on a deer carcass near the tracks. The coyote got startled by the oncoming train and dropped the chunk of meat he had in his mouth. The coyote runs back a few paces when my dad sees a big hawk swoop down and snatch up the chunk of meat and fly away. I work in association with NS but not for them per se. One day we get a call saying there was a man trapped in a train car that was locked in there for 2 days. We thought they were kidding until our manager called us to go have a look. We get out there and found out the guy was a hobo from the other side of the state. Some kinds forced him on the train and locked him in. Hey, former Gandhi dancer, track repairman, for the CN here. There is some pretty weird crap out there depending on what cities you run through. Mostly bodies, human or animal. One derailment I was called to was because someone had lit about 100 feet of track on fire and damaged the ties. When the train passed over, it pulled the spikes right out and the rails flopped over. Also, I was on site when a washout happened. We were there because the ballast was old and not draining correctly, and as I drove the truck over a section I looked out to see the whole embankment just slide out from under the track. Nature is a scary bee. Also, I've become really good at telling what animal a ribcage belongs to. Now I have a desk job. Sometimes I miss the field. My father-in-law is an engineer for MRL Montana Rail Link. Guy has seen the most gnarly stuff. He's seen people commit suicide by laying down on the tracks well after the train could ever think of slowing down. He said it just rips them apart like a nonchalant tear in a shirt. He's seen bears and bison and elk and kinds of wildlife get exploded not paying attention or freezing on the tracks. Worst part is that he and the crew have to do cleanup and police reports. Conductor of passenger rail here. Now that means I don't see nearly as much railroad as engineers freight conductors, but I've seen enough. There isn't so much as creepy anymore because a lot of things that happen up there are so common, i.e. hitting people, hitting every type of wildlife ever, and seeing people where you never thought someone would be at 3 AM because they like trains. The only thing that still makes me uncomfortable, other than trespasser strikes that are kids or non-suicides, is when it's super foggy out. Now when visibility is limited and you're still going 70 plus into a wall of fog, I have to leave the head end. It's something about the speed and not knowing what's 100 featuring ahead of you and having full faith in the signals and equipment. My dad was a special agent, detective. People stealing the signal wire were a big problem. Sometimes they would cut the wrong wire and he'd have to call someone to recover the body. Once Casey worked, thieves would wait at the base of a mountain for the piggyback train. When it slowed down, they would jump on and go to the UPS trailers and just start throwing packages out. Then go by later and pick them up. You'd be surprised at the things shipped UPS. Machine guns, for example. Frequent Amtrak rider here. I've seen more Texas red eyes and bare asses than some internet butt pee fetishists. Also some pretty obvious M-labs. Homeless bridge dwellers don't wipe and rich dude bros and woo girls along waterfronts have some very white cottage cheese asses. Oh, and homeless camps. It's like the fricking Great Depression, but the government won't admit it. The saddest thing I see quite often is people tie dogs to the tracks, like fight and bait dogs. To anyone that does that, get fricked. I can deal with a lot, but hitting a creature that is stuck on the tracks against their own will bothers me. Seriously, go frick yourself. It's not my story, but my granddad worked his way up from a station cleaner to a signal operator. At one stage in his career, he was responsible for cleaning up after suicides. Now if somebody jumps in front of a train moving at speed, two things can happen. You can fall in front of the train and get crushed by its wheels. This is nice and clean because the heat of the wheels, caused by friction against the tracks, cauterizes the wound, and all the cleanup crew needs to do is scrape you off. Lovely jubbly. This story concerns a fellow who hit the train at height and was splattered across the windscreen. Granddad and his boys were sent to find all the bits and put them in a bag. They looked all day and couldn't find the head. Eventually it grew dark and they postponed the search. The next morning, they didn't have to look long. The crows had done the job for them. This guy's head had been launched 2 stories up onto an old water tower, where it had somehow come to rest. Now, my granddad may have been bullshitting, but what creeped me out the most about his story was how much it amused him. When my dad was a kid, he and his friends were walking along the railroad tracks one day. They heard the train coming, so they ran and hid in the bushes while it passed. Afterwards, they went back to what they were doing and about 5 minutes later came across what he says is by far the worst thing he has ever seen in his life. Someone tied up 2 dogs and left them on the tracks. They were both freshly decapitated. He still wishes he wouldn't have gotten there sooner to save them. I was driving down a rural road in Wyoming, going from one drilling rig to another. This was in the Powder River Basin, so there's coal mining going on too, and men are train tracks that carry all that coal away. So I'm driving a pickup with a guy named John. There's a truck pulling a lowboy ahead of us. He's got a tractor on the lowboy. We come to the train crossing, which is pretty rough. The lowboy starts to crawl over the tracks, then stops. He got hung up on the tracks. I stop for a minute and ask John, hey, should we stop and help? John says, heck no, he did it to his own dumb butt, so, he's the boss. So I keep going. We go down about a mile and the road curves around and then starts heading back the way we had come. We were pretty close to the rig, but not so close that the rig noise could drown out the sound of a train whistle. I look back at the tracks and that low boy is still sitting right where we left him. Holy crap, John. There's a train coming and that guy's still on the tracks. I stopped the truck. Quick, drive up that hill so we can see better. He's the boss, so I go. As I am climbing the hill, unable to see anything, I hear a noise. Not sure if it's the rig or not, but something. We get over the hill and can't see, so we do our thing on the rig and start heading back. Train is stopped on the tracks. I stop the pickup and start walking to get around the train. I was so scared that there was gonna be death and mayhem on the other side, but if there was, I figured we were the last people to see that guy alive, so we'd better go see. Got around the train and it was all good. The train barely nicked the truck, knocking it askew, but the lowboy and tractor were sitting there just fine and the driver was okay too. I often wonder if we had stopped, if we would have all been so engrossed in trying to get that lowboy off the tracks, if we would have even noticed the train coming. I'll never know, but it was still a weird experience for me. New conductor here. Can confirm that the people you see sitting in their cars near the tracks are definitely fapping to trains. We call them foamers. Creepiest thing I ever saw was in West Philly. Someone cut a pit bull's head off and stuck it on a sticks in the shape of a cross beside the track. They stuffed fruit and flowers in the body where the head was and spread flowers around it. There was an unlit candle at the base of the cross. Looked like some fricked up voodoo crap. Not an engineer, but I do work aboard a passenger rail train. One day we had to slow down to go around a corner on a single track with a crossing just past the corner. When we had just rounded the corner, the engineers slammed on the brakes, stopped and got out. It had turned out that someone had tied a dog to the tracks, in the hopes that he got hit by a train. There was an SPCA worker on board the train too. She made a couple of calls. The dog had a foster home within the hour. I worked for a short line in the 80s. A girl crashed into the middle of our train at a crossing. The Mustang was rolled several times and completely destroyed. She got out wearing only a wedding veil, nothing else. A boy got out wearing only tighty whities. She was crying saying her boyfriend was gonna kill her, but he seemed calm. We didn't understand until the owner of the car got there. Her boyfriend, the kid who was bleeding, ran away through the woods with car owner in hot pursuit. What a day. I have a number of family members who run trains. They seem to all have a story of looking into someone's eyes the moment before the train hits them. It's a horrible thing to experience while just doing your job. Drunk people and kids mostly. The drunk people die. The kids are often fricking. Sometimes they die too. Don't fricking walk on the railroad tracks. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.